talk is really about, I guess, an untapped opportunity to improve the ecological values of landscapes, but also to give benefits to primary production as well. And so this has sort of been known about for a long time, but at the moment it's not really used in landscape management a lot. Most of the information is summarised from a report that I produced about a year ago for NRM on Kangaroo Island. So that's available from me if you'd like it, or from KI NRM, or also on ResearchGate if you're part of that online community. Okay, so some quick concepts. Ecosystem services you've heard about multiple times, and while that's a simple definition, the way they're actually, I guess, classified for different industries and for economic accounting is still being worked through. And the main idea of this management of vegetation is for landscape resilience, which is basically to keep ecosystems above a threshold, above functional threshold, so that the functioning is okay. And adaptive capacity is the other thing. So we want these systems to be able to adapt to change. And basically, from a biological perspective, diversity is really important for that. So not only species diversity, which people mostly think of, but also genetic diversity, population diversity, ecosystem diversity, etc. But there's also an economic imperative here, I guess, with farming. And that's the idea here is to increase the landscape level ecosystem services to maximise flexibility and resilience of economic systems. Okay, so the report dealt with a whole bunch of ecosystem services that native vegetation provides, but today I'm just going to talk about really the top three, which are all mainly to do with agriculture, and they feed into the adaptive capacity and resilience of the landscape. Okay, so the first thing is to think about invertebrates and their contribution to biodiversity. So there's hundreds and thousands of species in Australia, and they represent about 95% of the animals on the land. So the top figure there, you may be familiar with, it's a speciescape where the different groups of organisms are drawn at the size of their diversity. And as you can see, the biggest thing there is a fly, and that's because insects are the single most diverse group on the land, and you might notice that the other large groups, such as mites, worms, snails and things, are also very large. But if you consider reptiles, birds and mammals, they're basically an insignificant proportion of the biodiversity by numbers. And the thing about invertebrates is they're key influences of the dynamics of natural systems and also of agriculture. So they're food sources, they disperse seeds, they eat seeds, they eat plants, they regulate each other's populations, they do a whole bunch of stuff, and that's why I call it movers and shakers in ecology, because from a functional perspective and also from a biodiversity perspective, these are the things that make it work. So microorganisms do as well, but they're not animals, but they would have a similar impact. But in terms of the functioning of these systems, this is where it's at. And the thing about insects is that they have a whole bunch of interactions with each other and with other organisms, and often these are highly specific. Sometimes it's sort of they interact with a few things, sometimes they're more general. But what this means is, given their diversity and these specific interactions, is that you can manipulate insect populations by manipulating plant populations, whereas if everything just worked in a general way, you wouldn't be able to do that. And it's important that many have close associations with plants. So most of the plants you can think of will have different insects on them, and most of the parts of the plant will have different insects on them. So for example, lots of insects eat seeds, some concentrate on roots, etc. So there's significant capacity to, I guess, manipulate these systems to change the invertebrates in it. However, despite their diversity and their functional importance, and this was alluded to before, they are really hardly ever considered in conservation management and in NRM. So there's one insect listed as endangered in South Australia, which doesn't really make sense, but that's how it is. And that's only basically a regional listing for Kangaroo Island. Okay, so in terms of pest management and biosecurity, they're really related issues in terms of vegetation management. So people think of pest management as really dealing with stuff that's here and often an immediate effect or an adjacent effect, whereas biosecurity is more about planning for the introduction of new species and planning for their spread. So they're the same sort of ideas, but biosecurity, I guess, is on a bigger scale and involves more of a planning aspect, where pest management is about responding to pest pressure. But they're both significantly impacted by plants and insects in the landscape. And we know about many of these impacts and the effect of this, but up till now it's been quite difficult to quantify in an economic sense. And so this is why vegetation management for these regions really hasn't been taken up yet, but we know that this is happening. And so how do we know this? There's some general principles. So all of these have exceptions to the rule. It's ecology after all, it's a complex system. But in general, crops and pastures, their pests and diseases and the weeds associated with them are generally introduced species. However, beneficial invertebrates, such as predators and parasites that I just mentioned, are common in native vegetation. So these useful insects are very common in the native vegetation. And some research we did on the North Adelaide Plains showed that we actually had biocontrol agents of pests that aren't in Australia yet already living in the native vegetation. So it showed us that we could actually manipulate vegetation to put these biocontrol agents there ahead of the arrival of a new pest. And another thing is that crops, pastures and weeds are often in the same plant family, so they're generally introduced. Lots of them occur in the same family, so they're closely related, and therefore they support the same pests, diseases and disease vectors. And I've underlined diseases and disease vectors because these are the key things in terms of agricultural production and that have the biggest effect on the economics and the production systems themselves. Okay, so an example of this is the plant family Brassicaceae. So there's a whole bunch of crops that are brassicas. A lot of them are almost the same plant, but there's some key ones there: canola, cabbage, broccoli, etc. But there's also a whole bunch of weeds that are very closely related in that same family. So Lincoln weed, you see all over the place, skeleton weed, and these plants all support a whole bunch of important agricultural viruses as well, and also pest invertebrates. And some of the invertebrates that I've shown there, so these three aphids and the western flower thrips, are viral vectors. So these things don't matter so much because they chew on plants, but they transfer viruses into crop which have a big effect. But if you look in native plants, and these figures come from KI, so it'll vary a little bit in other places, but there's not many brassicas in native vegetation. So 1% of the species on Kangaroo Island are brassicas of native species, and native brassicas are just not abundant. So even when they're there, they're small plants, they don't cover a big area, they don't make up much of the landscape in native vegetation, and therefore the pest invertebrates and the viruses they support are quite rare in native vegetation as well. And there's other examples. So Solanaceae is another important one that has tomatoes, capsicums, etc. Again, there's not many native Solanaceae, and a lot of the weeds are Solanaceae and have different viruses. So potato viruses, for example, tomato viruses are common in solanaceous weeds. Okay, so if you've got no vegetation left and you have a good year with rain, which is what most primary producers want, you end up with a situation like this, which is basically that a whole bunch of broad-leafed weeds come up that support pests. And I've shown pictures there of the three aphids that I mentioned, and they're very common in this sort of environment. And aphids are a good illustration of this because there's about 150 in Australia and about 15 are native. And these native aphids basically live on strange plants like podocarps and things like that. They really do not like, introduced natives do not like hard-leaf plants like eucalypts, plants like that. They like these introduced weeds that are broad-leafed, soft-leaf things. Okay, and so what we know also, this was actually talked about in the keynote this morning with Phil Weinstein, that basically highly biodiverse systems buffer against changes, and native vegetation is the same. If it's in good condition, hasn't got many weeds in, basically it stops weeds coming in and other species being able to come in. So you've got this buffer by having intact vegetation. And weeds and viruses, therefore, and pests more easily infest areas that are degraded or frequently disturbed. So non-managed farmland, roadsides, things like that. And so this opens up areas where if we can get good quality native vegetation in them, not only does it help biodiversity, but there is a contribution to agriculture, which gives primary producers, I guess, some benefit of having the native vegetation there, where often they don't see that. Now, in terms of biosecurity, if you're going to have a new pest or insect or disease come in, the 4 things there in red are basically variables that are affected by the native vegetation in the landscape. So the suitable area available for something when it comes in matters a lot. The number of hosts in the landscape and their interconnectedness matters. The presence and abundance of viral vectors or vectors for the insects to be on matter. And the presence and degree of competing factors or control measures, that's important. So native vegetation affects all those things. Okay, so therefore, I've sort of alluded to a lot of this. Native vegetation provides these services by inhibiting the establishment of weeds or mitigating weed pressure, providing resources for beneficial invertebrates, reducing pest and disease pressure, especially near crops if the vegetation's there, supplying beneficial invertebrates into crop early in the growing season or early in the pest pressure, inhibiting the movement of pests and diseases by fragmenting weed populations, and reducing the chance of establishment and rate of spread of new pests and diseases. So good quality native vegetation will impact in those ways. And industry is actually beginning to realise this, and as I said, this has sort of been intuitive for a lot of people for a long time. And interestingly, research is really coming from areas where there's not much vegetation left. So Kangaroo Island's lucky, it's nearly got half the landscape still covered. Whereas somewhere like the Yorke Peninsula really hasn't got much, the Northern Adelaide Plains, and that's where people have started doing the research because basically you don't know what value it's giving you until you've got a problem. And that's a big problem for ecosystem services in general, that you really find it hard to quantify them until you haven't got them anymore and you have issues to deal with. But it does suggest that there is significant free pest management services when you have the vegetation there already, even if we can't quantify it. And this is generally recognised, as I said, by primary producers, but largely underrated. Because of our inability to really nail this down from an economic perspective, it hasn't been something that's had wide uptake, because producers really want to know that you are going to influence the economics of their system and the details of how that can happen, and guidelines, I guess. But you can see there a fact sheet from a year ago from the GRDC, which is basically saying you should have native vegetation near your crop because beneficial insects can come in early in pest pressure. So there is some recognition of that. And so there's lots of benefits from native vegetation, obviously, but still, as most of you would know, it's quite a controversial topic, particularly on Kangaroo Island, where there is still a lot there. And this is a car sticker from Kangaroo Island that sort of illustrates that you know, some people see really not much value in native vegetation at all. So people that want to get bigger and bigger fields and use mechanised machinery often see veg as something that's in the way, whereas people that are interested in ecology or resilience of farming systems or smaller scale agriculture would see a benefit. But at this stage it is still quite a controversial issue in terms of management and the government managing people's vegetation. Okay, so the other main thing that is contributed by native vegetation is pollination. This has become a big topic around the world because basically in Europe and the US they've lost a lot of the wild pollination services, and so they're trying to recover that. And what we know is that native vegetation supports hundreds of potential native pollinators, and they include bees, wasps, flies, but a whole bunch of things and a great diversity of things. And from an ecological perspective, it's important because native bees are crucial for pollination of some of our native plants. So a lot of our native plants are adapted to being what they call buzz pollinated or pollinated via vibration. And honeybees cannot do this sort of pollination, whereas a lot of the native bees that are adapted with our plants can. And that's an example there. The blue-banded bee is a great buzz pollinator. And there's some of the examples of the plants that need buzz pollination. So a lot of lilies, hibiscus, a lot of the pea flowers, things like that need this form of pollination. So native bees are actually crucial for ecology and beneficial to agriculture. Okay, so as I said, we know this is going on, but there has been a bit of an inability to put this in hard economic terms and generate guidelines that people can use. But what we do know from research is that intensification of agriculture leads to pollination trade-offs for crops and the environment. Bee abundance is correlated with complexity, and pollination services from native veg does occur for different crops and environments, and that's driven by the amount of pollinators. So for canola crops in temperate Australia, they found that wild honeybee density at the margin is greater than the centre, so the bees are coming from the outside. Basically, wild honeybee density correlated with woody vegetation within 300 metres of the crop, and hoverflies and native bees visited more than honeybees. In a large global study with 39 crops, they found wild bee abundance and diversity is higher in the landscape with more quality habitat, so heterogeneous landscapes. Also, in organic or multi-crop fields, there were higher abundance of pollinators, and both studies showed bee diversity in low diversity agriculture correlated with high quality surrounding landscape. So to conclude, pollinator resilience will depend upon maintaining quality habitat around farms. Local management can reduce pollination trade-offs inherent in intensive monocultures, and more broadly, for the whole talk, the management of vegetation across a landscape can be tailored to provide benefits to biodiversity and targeted to primary production as well, but this requires interaction with innovative primary producers and also an understanding of their systems and how they manage it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Unfortunately, we've gone a little bit over there, so we've got no time for questions. You might have to catch Richard at the break. The next talk we've got